This is part two of music reading for singers. In the first lesson, we talked that reading sheet music is about pitches, also reading rhythm. There's going to be a third lesson about song navigation and instruction. It tells you how to go back and forth through the song and sing things like choruses and verses. This one, number two, will be about learning rhythm. First thing about rhythm is we have to understand in Western music there is a pulse that underlies the music. The staff that it's written on represents time going from left to right. It's divided into measures where you see either the end of the line or a vertical bar line that says that this is a certain amount of time. How much time in seconds is that? We don't really know. And that's not really what we're thinking about. We're going to see a time signal. And this is the beginnings of understanding how the pulse works. In this example, we see 4 over a 4. Just focusing on the top 4, it tells us how many beats, pulses, are in the measure. So we know we're going to 4 in this measure and the measure after that. The other thing that we need is the tempo, which is how fast the pulse is. Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, or is it 1, 2, 3, 4? Tempo tells us how fast. And it's given to us either as an absolute number of beats per minute that we can check with a metronome, or with words, which are usually Italian. And there's lots of words. There's about 20 of them that are common. And they roughly correspond to beats per minute. The ones you'll see will be like moderato, around 90, allegro, which is like 120, or adagio, or andante, which is like 70 or 80 beats per minute. There are words for going faster and words for going slower. We're going to assume for this particular lesson that the tempo remains constant throughout the song. Not necessarily true. We'll cover that in the next lesson. What does the lower number in the time signature mean? It tells us what do we count as a beat in the measure. And this can be a very complicated discussion, but I'll try to break it down. The 4/4 time signature, we break it apart, tells us the top number is 4, tells us 4 beats in the measure. If we take the 4 away, we get a 1/4 or quarter note, or 4 for quarter note. It tells us that there are 4 beats per measure and that a quarter note, 1/4 note, is a beat. But you don't know what a quarter note is. You might. A quarter note has to be defined in terms of other notes. So a whole note is this open, unfilled oval, and it counts for 4 beats. A half note is an unfilled oval with a stem, and it counts 2 beats. You with me so far? A quarter note is a filled in oval with a stem, and it's 1 beat. So a 4/4 signature is telling us there are 4 1 beats of these quarter notes in time value in every measure of the song. That top number 4 can be any number, but it's usually, say 75% of the time, is going to be 4. Oftentimes you'll see a 3, but there can be others for experiencing later on in life. The bottom number usually is 4. It can be other even numbers, but 4 is what you're going to see the most commonly. By the way, the 4/4 time signature is so common that some people call that common time. And instead of seeing a 4/4, you're going to see this symbol that looks like a C for common time. That's how common it is. So let's start learning rhythm by counting how to measure, but we have to look at the measure first before we start doing anything. In the top measure, we see that it's 4/4 and the tempo is moderato. It tells us a lot of things. It tells us there are 4 beats in the measure. The beat is counted as quarter notes because its lower number is a 4. And it's moderato, which we saw from that sliding scale, is maybe 80 beats per minute, maybe 90 beats per minute. It's all about feeling. So we play the speed that makes sense to us. Not too fast, not too slow. It's moderato, which is Italian for moderate. Let's hear what that sounds like. And what you're going to be hearing as a count off in the speed of 90 beats per minute. 4 beats, then you'll hear the notes being played by a piano. Now that should make sense. The second measure says it's 3/4. And it says has the symbol above it, which is the quarter note symbol equals 120, which means that tempo is 120 beats per minute. Much faster than moderato. I call this allegro. There are 3 quarter notes to be counted in time value in every measure. This is what it sounds like. You can tell, a lot faster. 1, 2, 3. A lot faster. Every measure that you approach, you do this exactly the same way to understand how to count it. A note is about a length of time taken up in the measure. It's the length that the note is heard. Not just saying 1, 2, 3, 4 is a beat, but there is a time of the note ringing out, whether your voice, whether it's a violin or a piano, the same thing, it's ringing out for a period of time. Now, in the idea below here, if you were singing la la la, your breath would not stop. If we had 4 quarter notes in a 4/4 measure, and we're going to keep the tempo around moderate, that each one of those notes would fill up all the time between each note. So if you're singing, you'd say la, 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 and use your tongue to delineate the start of each new note. This would be the ideal case. Here it is played with an organ. So the breaks that we're taking between each note is really hitting the key again. Same thing for a piano. If you're using a violin, you might take the bow back and forth to delineate the notes. Let's try this with half notes. So each half note is going to take up half the measure, or a full count of 2 before the next note is hit. Lastly, we can do it with a whole note. A whole note counts 4 beats, and it will take up the entire time of the measure. Every measure is full of either sound or silence, or a combination of the two. The sound, of course, are notes, but the silence are called rests. Rests have length just like notes. For each one of the notes we've learned, there is a corresponding symbol for a rest that takes the same number of beats. A whole rest counts for 4 beats, and it's this rectangle that hangs from the 4th line of the staff. A half rest takes 2 beats, and it sits on the 3rd line of the staff, and the quarter rest is 1 beat corresponding to a quarter note, and it's this squiggly line thing that doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before. Let's listen to some examples of how we fill a measure with sound and silence, either with all sound, no sound, or a combination of both. Here's the first one. It's a whole note, so you know from before what's going to happen. 4 beats of sound. In the second one, we still have a measure full of sound. It just has 2 quarter notes and a half note taking up all 4 beats. In the third example, we finally see that quarter rest, which is taking up the second beat of the measure. So there's a quarter note, a rest, a quarter note, a quarter note, which equals 4 beats full of sound, which equals 4 beats, taking up all the time of the measure. Fourth example, we won't hear anything on the first beat. We won't hear anything on the third beat. So it kind of goes back and forth. So the first beat can be silent. Happens a lot. This next measure has 2 quarter notes in the first half of the measure and nothing in the second half of the measure. It's silent. The last measure I don't have to play anything because if we establish the count of 1, 2, 3, 4, we're going to hear nothing for 1, 2, 3, 4. But the measure is full of silence. There are shorter durations than quarter notes. If we add a flag to the symbol for a quarter note, we get an 8th note, which is 1/2 the time value of the quarter note, or a half of a beat. Its rest is a little stick with a single flag on it. If we add another flag to the note, we divide its time value in half again, which makes it a 16th note, and its rest is a corresponding 2 flag symbol. It's equal to 1/4 of a beat, 1/4 of a beat. And with these divisions like this, either twice as fast or twice as long, people have learned how to communicate music for a long time, for centuries. So it works. And the reason we do it is that we can feel half as long or half as short. You'd say, well, why don't we divide measures into tenths? We've got 10 fingers, right? But most people can't feel what 1/10 is. It's not natural feeling to us. Everything for us is really based on our heartbeats. And we understand fast, we understand slow, we understand the divisions of two. Another way to change the duration of the note is either to add a dot to it or to tie it to another note. When we add a dot to a note, we're adding 1/2 its value in time. In the case here of the dotted half note, a half note's 2 beats. The half of it would be 1, so it's 3 beats, which is equivalent to a half note tied to a quarter note with that little line. When two notes are tied together on the same pitch line, they become the same note, and you don't strike it again. It rings out for 3 beats. Same thing goes for the quarter note. The dotted quarter note is a quarter note plus an eighth note. So in our terminology of counting it, when it was 1 and 2 and as far as eighth notes, it would be a 1 and 2 length note, or the equivalent of 3/8 notes. Since a quarter note is 2/8 notes, I tie one more together, I get 3/8 notes. And the same thing goes for dotted eighth notes. It's just the equivalent of 3/16 notes, or an eighth note tied to a 16th. A tie can extend the note, its length, beyond a measure. So all measures are full of sound and silence, but we can actually extend past the end of the measure by tying it to a note of the same pitch, which means we don't stop playing it. As we learned in the previous lesson, if there had been a sharp sign, a natural sign, or a flat sign on the first part of that tied note, that pitch would not change as it crossed into the next measure, just to reinforce it. Let's listen to what that one sounds like. A way of depicting a bunch of eighth notes together is to connect them with this beam, because drawing the flags can be messy. If it's a 16th note, well, we use 2 beams. So in the top measure, we have 4 eighth notes. And in the bottom measure, we have 4 16th notes. You see they go twice as fast. It's a very useful thing. You're going to see beams an awful lot. Underneath that beam, we can combine different numbers of beams, as well as dots and sometimes rests and other things, but we won't talk about that now. These combinations are just a quick shorthand of putting as much information under a bar as possible. It's cleaner looking, but some people get a little bit confused by it. It can be daunting. Let's just listen to them now and we'll figure out how to understand how to play them or how to sing them a little bit later on. So here's the first one. And the second one. And the third one. The last way to think about rhythm that we haven't covered about is called a triplet. This means we're going to put the value of 3 notes in the amount of time we would have normally played 2 notes. So for the half note, which is 2 beats, we would say normally play 2 quarter notes. It's 2 quarter notes long. But what if we were to put 3 notes in the same time space as the half note or the 2 beats. This would be called a quarter note triplet. Let's just see what it sounds like. I'm going to leave the metronome running so you can see how each one of these is played. So you heard that characteristic 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. This type of sound happens in music all the time. So it's not anything to get nervous about. It's very, very common, and you'll probably end up enjoying them a whole lot once you get used to them. They work the same for making triplets out of quarter notes. So we'd see in that case, in the one beat, we put 3 notes. So 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3 in one beat. And lastly, we can do the same thing for eighth notes and put 3 16th notes where an eighth note goes. So we've covered some what may be complicated looking things, and I wouldn't blame you if you thought it sounded complicated. There are methods people use to sort out rhythm. So we figure out what we're supposed to do before we sing it. And we can slow the tempo down and try to break up the more complicated things. Some things you'll get used to faster, but the whole idea is that we count them. And there are counting methods for the kinds of notes that we're seeing. In this first case where we're seeing quarter notes, well, we know kind of from figuring out the pulse of the measure that we count 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's fine for quarter notes. But for counting eighth notes, what do? How much time does an eighth note take up? Well, this is where we notate it with this 1 plus 2 plus thing, but it's actually 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So we've divided verbally the counting of quarter notes into eighth notes. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and is me saying 8 things in the time space of me saying 1, 2, 3, 4. So in this case, we're counting that there's a note on the 1, the and, the 2, the and, the 3. There's no note on the and of the 3, right? It's a rest. That's that rest sign for eighth notes, and then 4 and. So I'd expect 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 notes, a rest, and then 2 more notes. This is what it sounds like. This last one is one of those measures people just groan looking. But the way we count 16th notes is breaking up the beat into 4 verbal statements. So we say 1 E and a, remember the plus sign's the and, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, etc. So the 1 E and a part is taking the beat and cutting it verbally into 4 equally spaced pieces, which is what a 16th note is. There are 4 16th notes in one beat, and there are 16 16th notes in a 4/4 measure. This one here, we're counting 1 E and a with a beat on all 4 of them for 8 of those, then getting to the third beat where it's 3, but this is another 16th note, so when we get to this dotted eighth, it takes up the E and a component, or 3 16th notes of value, because it's a dotted eighth note. So it's 1, 2, and then one more of these guys, so it's 3 16th notes, and then 2 eighths, which are going to take up 2 of them, Or I could have just said 4 and, right? But we're saying 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3. But we're saying 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4 E and a. And here's what it really sounds like. Not so bad. So that was kind of fast at that tempo. So if you really had to figure out how to sing it, how to play it, you slow down the tempo and then do it again by counting 1 E and a, as slowly as you have to understand how things fit together. Once you understand the relative rhythms of things, then you can speed the tempo back up to the way the song is supposed to be sung or a song is supposed to be played, the way the composer intended it, or the way you want to do it. The whole idea is not to get intimidated by it. There is a way that all of us in music break this down into its pieces until you get used to seeing what you're seeing and it becomes more natural. The last thing to cover are chords. Again, from a vocal viewpoint, those are notes that occur at the same time. They're stacked on top of each other. That means there's 2 of you singing at least, or maybe a bunch of you singing in a choir. And the point here is that in this first case, the 2 notes will sound together for 4 beats. But in the second case, the top voice isn't going to sound for 2 beats. It's going to sound for 1 beat a piece, or 1 quarter note a piece. Just be aware of it. That's what chords do. And if you're singing along with somebody, they may keep singing while you're changing the note. As you can imagine, this takes practice because it's like learning to read a different human spoken language, although it's a whole bunch simpler than any foreign language I know. You have to look at a bunch of different songs or the songs that you're working on, and each one that you figure out by yourself, especially if you don't know how the song goes, will make this even better exercise. So don't just always look at songs that you know because you might be making it a little bit too easy on yourself. Do some stuff that even if you're not really going to sing it, just look at it and see if you can figure out what the rhythm ought to be. And then go listen to a version of it and see how close you got. The idea is you're going to start looking at patterns and recognizing patterns. 4/16 notes or those crazy dotted notes. What do they do? Triplets. What do they feel like? You're going to get that vocabulary built up very quickly. There isn't a whole lot to learn. There aren't many rules. So here's the formula for reading rhythm. You look at the time signature, 4/4, 3/4, whatever. It tells us how many beats from the measure. It tells us which note takes the beat. Usually it's 4. The tempo, we figure out either it's words or a number. We don't have to rehearse the thing or figure out the rhythm at the speed it's supposed to be at if it's too fast. But ultimately, we're going to take it to that tempo and then play it at that tempo. So set a tempo in your mind, and just like we had here with the illustrations, count in the measures, and then start seeing how much time each note takes and each rest takes until you filled up the whole measure with sound and silence. So that's it. Stay tuned for number 3, and thanks for listening.